when it comes to this new wave of fighters speaking out publicly, talking about all this stuff, your initial impressions of this is this different than other times that this has happened? Say back when Randy Couture did it, or anything like that. Is a union or trade association much more possible right now, or are there still, too many roadblocks in the way? What's your gut feeling on that?
Well, my gut feeling, it's a little different in the sense that the fighters seem much more informed now than they did in the past. So they're which is surprising. I mean, for years I was always surprised because I used to speak to a lot of fighters. I don't talk to them as much anymore, but I'd speak to them and I was surprised they didn't know anything about the finances of the business because we've been posting stuff on it. I mean, it wasn't definite, but now, I mean, they're bringing up specific percentages. A few years ago, I would talk to fighters and I'd say, well, it's, they go, well, we don't know how much the UFC pays us for the revenue. I go, yeah, we do. We posted it was 20%. We've done estimates at the time. We didn't have the actual court documents back then. The fighters were unaware of it. So obviously the fighters are more aware now than they were just even a few years ago. And I guess that's a positive. You have change, you got to have informed fighters. I'm always a little pessimistic because it's MMA is the UFC, MMA, the whole economy of mixed martial arts is not very conducive to having a union, having an organization. And it's not just because of the way the fighters are, that they're individuals. The way the league, even though MMA promotions are not leagues, they're promoters, but they call themselves leagues. The way it's set up makes it very difficult to work. The way the economy of the industry, the whole system is set up, it's very difficult for this to succeed. And that always fills me with pessimism. And it's because there's no simple solution. I think a lot of fans are like, oh, if you guys would just form a union and strike. It's not that simple. That stuff is not, first, it's very hard to form a union, especially in the climate. And it might not work the way you think it will. So it's different in the sense that fighters are more knowledgeable. There seems to be, I think we're kind of reaching a breaking point. Fighters, they know they're not getting a fair share, but I'm not convinced that we've reached a point where things are going to change, because that might be the next step, because people I don't think are quite, they might know that things are not right, but they don't know what to do. Until they figure out what to do, what happens? Everybody's just going to be kicking dirt, wondering what to do.
Yeah, 100%. And as you said, I've seen a lot of people, I know you have on your social media, of just like, oh, they should form a union, should do that. I mean, that's not an easy process. There's a whole list of ramifications that go into that Leslie Smith has covered. I'm not sure the NLRB head would certify them as
right now they're classified as independent contractors. At least everybody assumes they're classified as independent contractors. And the only one that can overturn that, IRS and NLRB, is that the Trump administration is actively hostile to organized labor. I mean, really hostile. If you pay attention to what they're doing, they do not like unions. They don't like, they like corporate power, and worker power is not a priority to them. So it's going to be first you'd have to get all the fighters to sign on. Second, you'd have to then get the NLRB to approve you to be employees and not independent contractors. If they don't do that, if you're ruled independent contractors, then your union effort was wasted. Even if you form a union, there's very little you might be able to do in this climate, because people always say, like, well, fighters deserve 50% of the revenue. How are you going to get 50% of the revenue? I mean, going on strike, labor stoppages, I don't think are going to be effective with fighters, because the very simple fact is you just need a small group of fighters to cross the line, to not strike. And you can put on an event, because the UFC puts events on every 2 weeks. This isn't the NFL where everybody plays the same weekend. So if half the players don't show up, you can't have games. They just have to book one event at a time. And so they only need a limited amount of fighters to cross the line. They can then re-sign new guys. There's an endless supply of fighters willing to come in. Fighters have very little money, so how long are they going to hold out? If they see they're holding events and other people are making money, how soon are more and more fighters going to cross the line? So I'm not confident labor stoppages will work. And even then, the reason the other leagues pay 50% of the revenue is not because the athletes go on strike. It's because the league decided that we need them to commit to not having free agency, because otherwise our expenses even rise higher. They're in the 60, 70% of revenue. So we're the ones, the owners are the ones that pitch 50%. It's not the players that ask for a 50% split. It's the owners that say, we will give you 50% if you give up these certain rights. We can commit violations of the Sherman Act and commit and have a monopoly. But in exchange for us having a monopoly, we're going to guarantee you half the revenue.
Yeah, no, I think that's a huge insight that people overlook. That exactly, it's the leagues that bring the 50% to the fighters. It's not that the fighters, work and scratch and manage to chip it away. It's exactly for that purpose. And one thing I wanted to ask you as well, in regards to that split, right now we're around 20%. Given the way everyone's just saying, oh, you just need to bump it up to, 30, 40, 50. But given the way the UFC has kind of positioned themselves with, Endeavor obviously has a lot of debt, which is separate from the UFC, but even UFC's debt is 2.3 billion or something, around that range, what you reported on last year. And their credit's been downgraded by Moody's during the pandemic, everything like that. Let's say that, pigs fly and UFC says, you know what, we want to go ahead and give fighters now 40, 50%. Is that even feasible at this point, given that if they had to, given the way they're debt leveraged, is that feasible that they could make that change anywhere near soon? Wouldn't it have to be pretty incremental?
Well, okay, if we take a year, let's say not this year. This year is an oddity because we lose the gate revenue and we have the pandemic, so they're going to have less revenue. But let's expect that next year they're going to make 90 million, and they're going to give the fighters, or they're going to make not 90 million. They're going to make actually their projections were, let's say in next year, the year after that, they hit $1 billion because that was their projections, $1 billion. They're going to pay the fighters 20%, 200 million for the fighters. The UFC's total revenues is $1 billion. Their costs are fixed. They don't really rise. They stay the same every year, so their profits go up. So they already project that their EBITDA, their earnings, is going to be about 50%. So you got 500 million in earnings, 200 million in for the fighters. Well, the payoff, that 2.3 billion, it's actually 2.46 billion now loan because they took off from the revolver, so they have to pay that back. But to pay that off at the old rate, this gets so confusing. But the interest rates have actually plummeted because governments have cut interest rates to kind of stimulate the economy. But let's say next year goes back to normal. The old interest, what they were paying before, was about 145 million a year, and then covered interest and the 1% amortization per year they had to pay off for that loan. So 500 million, they only need 145 to pay the loan. Well, guess what? That leaves a lot left over for the fighters. If you really wanted the fighters to get 50%, they could still afford to give the fighters, 50% and still make a small 5% margin profit.
Gotcha. Okay. So there is still room for them to do that, but obviously that 5% margin profit would,
Well, but also then Endeavor's expecting that money to help pay off their other stuff. That's where you get in trouble because Endeavor's going to have to collect 50% of that, and 25 million a year for Endeavor's probably not enough to cover the cost of William Morris's $5 billion, $4 additional billion in leverage or debt and liabilities that they have.
Right. Yes, exactly. And then that's, and we talked about the projections, because they're projecting to make $1 billion, but as Moody's credit report released, back in April, it seemed, at least according to what you found, their projections on the lender presentation of where they were in 2016 and how they were going to, end up at 940 million in 2019, things of that nature, but they only got 850. It looks like they didn't quite meet those lender presentation revenues. So, take that into account. Is there, again, if you could split the fighter revenue out, there's definitely wiggle room there. But in terms of it happening overnight with their other current obligations, no
matter what Endeavor does, Endeavor bought the UFC to make a bunch of money. They have no interest in increasing fighter pay. So you have to look at it. If you're going to increase fighter pay, you have to look at it regardless of what Endeavor wants. You have to make it fait accompli that Endeavor, this is the new standard, and you have to pay this amount if you want to stay in the UFC business.
Got it. Makes sense. Makes perfect sense to me.